She was 69 years old, standing in a white dress after a 12-year engagement, smiling at guests who didn't yet know the groom had just married someone else at a courthouse across town. Evelyn Harper had never expected to be a bride again in her lifetime, not after losing her first husband and spending nearly a decade learning how to be alone without feeling lonely. So when Daniel entered her life at a community book club and slowly, patiently, carefully became her companion, her partner, and eventually the man who proposed after 10 years together, it felt less like a new romance and more like a second chance that had arrived gently instead of dramatically. Her children liked him immediately. Her friends said he brought color back into her routines, and even Evelyn herself noticed how she began cooking more elaborate meals, dressing up for no reason, and laughing louder than she had in years. The wedding was meant to be small, intimate, held in the garden behind the old country church, where roses climbed over white fences and folding chairs had been arranged neatly on the grass that morning. There were no grand decorations, no orchestra, no extravagance. Just a quiet celebration of two older people deciding that life still had room for something beautiful. Guests chatted softly as a string of light instrumental music played through portable speakers, and Evelyn stood inside the church hall with her daughter adjusting the veil one last time while telling her, "You look happier than I've seen you in 20 years, Mom," and Evelyn believed it. She walked slowly toward the aisle when the music shifted, her heart beating not with nerves but with gratitude, because she felt lucky. Lucky that love had found her twice. Lucky that she still had the health to walk on her own. Lucky that at 69, she was not watching life from a distance, but stepping directly into it again. But when she reached the garden and turned the corner where Daniel should have been waiting under the small floral arch, she noticed something strange. The officiant stood alone, hands clasped, looking confused. Guests whispered. Daniel's best friend kept checking his phone. At first, she assumed he was simply late, maybe caught in traffic, maybe forgetting something at home, because Daniel had always been a little absent-minded. But then 5 minutes turned into 10, and 10 into 20, and the whispering grew louder. Someone tried calling him. Straight to voicemail. Someone else sent a message. No response. A faint tension began spreading across the chairs like a silent ripple. Then a young woman Evelyn had never seen before walked hesitantly toward her, holding a phone with trembling fingers and an expression that looked like guilt mixed with urgency. "Ma'am, I think you should see this," she said quietly, and when Evelyn looked down at the screen, time seemed to thin into something unreal. It was a photo posted less than 15 minutes earlier on social media. Daniel stood outside the courthouse downtown, wearing the same suit he had told Evelyn he would wear for their wedding. But he wasn't alone. He was holding hands with a woman in her 30s, smiling broadly at the camera, a marriage certificate visible between them. The caption read, "Just married my best friend Redheart." For a moment, Evelyn did not feel shock or anger or embarrassment. She felt an eerie, hollow calm, like the world had stepped backward and she was observing it from outside her own body. Around her, people gasped. Someone muttered a curse. Her daughter whispered, "Mom," but Evelyn simply reached up, removed the veil from her head, folded it neatly with deliberate care, and handed it to her daughter before saying in a voice so steady it startled everyone, "Please tell everyone the reception is canceled. I'm very sorry they came all this way." No tears came. No dramatic reaction followed. She walked back into the church hall, changed out of the white dress into the blue cardigan she had arrived in, thanked the florist, apologized to the caterer, and quietly left through the side door while guests were still trying to understand what had happened. She did not go home. The thought of walking into the house she had shared with Daniel for years, where his coffee mug still sat by the sink and his slippers were beside the bed, felt unbearable, not because of sadness, but because it suddenly seemed fake, like a movie set that had been dismantled without warning. So she got into her car and drove without deciding where she was going, passing familiar streets without seeing them, until she found herself on the old road that led toward the abandoned rail yard at the edge of town, a place she and Daniel used to walk on Sunday afternoons because he liked pointing out the rusted train cars and imagining what stories they had once carried. The gate was open as it always was, the gravel crunching under her tires as she pulled in and turned off the engine. The air smelled of metal and dry grass. She stepped out, feeling oddly grounded by the quiet, and walked between the rows of motionless cars until she reached one she recognized. a long, weather-worn observation car with cracked windows and peeling paint that Daniel once joked would make a romantic hideaway if someone were crazy enough to live in it. Evelyn climbed the small metal steps and peered inside through the broken glass. Dust covered the floor. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof. It was empty, forgotten, honest. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the door handle, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she felt something she hadn't felt since looking at that phone screen. Relief. Not grief. Not humiliation. Relief. As if the betrayal had stripped away a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for 12 years. That night, instead of returning to the house that now felt like a lie, Evelyn drove to a hardware store before it closed, bought cleaning supplies, a flashlight, and a cheap camping lantern, and returned to the train car. She pushed the stiff door open and stepped inside, sweeping aside dust, wiping down a small corner near the wall, and sitting there on the floor with her back against the metal as the evening light faded. It was quiet in a way her home had never been. No ticking clocks. No humming appliances. No shared history pressing in from every direction. Just stillness. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and realized, with surprising clarity, that she did not want to go back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. By the third morning, Evelyn Harper had done something that would have shocked every guest who watched her walk down that aisle. She decided the abandoned train car felt more like home than the house she had shared for 12 years with a man who vanished on their wedding day. She returned at sunrise with a thermos of tea, a broom, old rags, and a determination that surprised even her, prying open windows that had been stuck for decades, sweeping out layers of dust and leaves, and claiming a small corner near the curved glass at the back as her space. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was untouched by memory. She told no one where she was, not her children, not her friends, ignoring the dozens of missed calls and messages that ranged from outrage to concern, because she didn't yet have words to explain what she herself barely understood. She didn't feel broken. She felt unburdened. The train car smelled of rust and sunlight, and as she wiped down the metal walls and watched the light shift across the floorboards, she realized this was the first place she had sat in years where nothing reminded her of Daniel. No shared photos. No familiar chair. No echo of conversations. That afternoon she returned with a thin mattress from the guest room, a pillow, a wool blanket, and a small kettle, moving quietly through her house like a visitor packing for a trip she hadn't announced, deliberately avoiding the bedroom where his clothes still hung. By evening, she had arranged the mattress against the wall, placed the kettle on an old crate she'd found nearby, and strung a battery lantern from a hook in the ceiling so the space glowed softly instead of feeling abandoned. A stray brown dog wandered up the steps while she worked, sniffed cautiously at the doorway, and lay down outside as if he had been waiting for someone to arrive for years. She named him Rusty without thinking, sharing bits of biscuit from her bag, and for the first time since the wedding, she smiled without effort. Over the next few days, rail yard workers began to notice her quiet routine, arriving in the morning, leaving at dusk, carrying small supplies, and instead of questioning her, they greeted her with nods and gentle curiosity. One of them, a retired mechanic named Walter, offered her an old camping stove he had in his shed, saying only, "Figured you could use this," while another brought a sheet of thick plastic to cover the worst of the broken windows before the next rain. They didn't ask why a well-dressed woman in her 60s was cleaning out a derelict rail car. They simply accepted that she was there, and that acceptance felt kinder than sympathy. Evelyn patched the windows, wiped the walls clean, and even found a tin of pale blue paint in Walter's truck that she used to brighten the interior, transforming the metal shell into something unexpectedly gentle, stringing a line of tiny lights along the ceiling so that at night the car looked less like a ruin and more like a secret. She read for hours in the quiet, brewed tea on the stove, and talked softly to Rusty as he slept by the steps, realizing with a slow, dawning clarity that she had not felt this calm in over a decade. There were no questions here about where she had been, no subtle compromises, no adjustments to someone else's habits. Every inch of the space responded only to her. One afternoon, as she sat near the back window watching dust float through beams of sunlight, Walter mentioned casually that the entire rail yard had recently been purchased by developers who planned to turn it into a heritage park and small rail museum. "They're cataloging all the old cars next month," he said. "Some of these things are rare as gold now." Evelyn glanced around at the curved windows and brass fittings she had absent-mindedly polished and felt a flicker of curiosity she hadn't expected. Later, she walked slowly along the exterior of the car and noticed a small, tarnished metal plate near the door she had never paid attention to before, rubbing it clean with her sleeve until numbers and a name became visible beneath the grime. She didn't recognize the significance, but she sensed it meant something, like a label on a forgotten heirloom. The next morning, a man in a suit arrived with a clipboard and a camera, introduced himself as a railway historian, and stopped mid-sentence when he stepped inside and saw the freshly painted walls, the mattress, the kettle, and Evelyn sitting cross-legged with a book. He stared at the metal plate, then at her, then back at the plate as if he had stumbled into a miracle. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "do you know what you're living in?" Evelyn looked around at her blue walls, her fairy lights, Rusty dozing at the steps, and replied with a small smile, "Peace and quiet." The man let out a breathless laugh and explained that this was one of the last surviving 1920s Pullman observation cars thought to have been scrapped decades ago, a piece of railway history collectors had been searching for, and that its condition, despite the neglect, made it extraordinarily valuable to preservationists. Evelyn listened without excitement, almost detached, as he described restoration plans, museum interest, and historical significance, because what mattered to her was not what the car had been, but what it had quietly given her, a place untouched by betrayal where she could breathe again. Still, as more officials began visiting, photographing, and discussing offers in hushed, eager voices, she felt a strange sense of irony building inside her. The one place she had gone to disappear was becoming the center of unexpected attention. And somewhere in town, Daniel was hearing whispers about a story spreading quickly. The bride he left at the altar was living in an abandoned train car that had just been discovered to be worth a fortune. Evelyn didn't know that yet. She only knew that each evening, as she turned on the small lights and sat with Rusty at her feet, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if the life she thought had collapsed had quietly rearranged itself into something simpler, truer, and entirely her own. The morning the offers became real, Evelyn Harper was sitting on the metal steps of the train car with a mug of tea in her hands and Rusty's head resting against her ankle when 3 vehicles rolled slowly into the rail yard, carrying a historian, a preservation officer, and a private collector whose expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief the moment he stepped inside and saw the curved observation windows, the polished brass rails, and the pale blue walls that made the old carriage look less like a relic and more like a living room. They spoke in careful, excited tones about rarity, restoration, and historical value, explaining that this particular 1920s Pullman observation car was believed to be lost to time, and that museums across the state would compete fiercely to acquire it. And Evelyn listened without interruption, nodding politely as if they were describing someone else's good fortune rather than her own. When they finally mentioned numbers, large, breath-catching numbers, she didn't react with shock or delight. She simply asked one quiet question: "What happens to it if I agree?" They described the restoration process, the preservation of its original structure, the plan to display it as a centerpiece of the future heritage park so that families, children, and history lovers could walk through it and imagine the journeys it once made. Evelyn looked around the small space that had sheltered her grief without asking for explanations and realized she wanted it to live on, not as scrap metal, but as something meaningful. She agreed to sell. News traveled through town faster than she expected, carried by workers, by officials, by the simple human love of unusual stories, until by afternoon people were whispering about the bride who had been abandoned and then accidentally moved into a treasure. That was how Daniel found her. He arrived disheveled, eyes ringed with exhaustion, walking across the gravel like a man chasing a last chance he didn't quite believe he deserved. Evelyn saw him from a distance and felt no surge of anger, no trembling, no tightness in her chest, only a distant recognition, like seeing a character from a book she had already finished reading. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and tried to speak, his voice cracking as he said, "I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking. That girl, it was impulsive, it was stupid. I panicked about getting older, about commitment, about everything. I want to fix this." Please come home. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, noticing how unfamiliar it looked when she wasn't searching it for reassurance. For 12 years, she said softly. I thought you were my future. Daniel swallowed hard. I can still be, he whispered. She shook her head gently. No, because this place, she gestured to the train car behind her, gave me something you never did. He blinked, confused. What? Evelyn smiled, not with triumph, but with clarity. Freedom. She told him she wished him no harm, no revenge, no public humiliation, but she would not return to a life that now felt like a costume she had finally taken off. Daniel stood there a while longer, as if waiting for emotion to change her mind, but when none came, he walked away across the yard, smaller somehow than when he had arrived. A week later, a crane carefully lifted the restored observation car from the tracks, while workers guided it with reverence, and Evelyn watched from a distance with Rusty beside her, feeling grateful rather than sad, as if she were seeing off an old friend who had helped her through a difficult season. The money from the sale was transferred quietly into her account, enough to change the rest of her life without fanfare, and she used it not to reclaim her old house or chase anything familiar, but to buy a small cottage by the sea in a town where no one knew her story. She packed only what she needed, left the rest behind without regret, and drove toward a horizon she had not planned but somehow trusted. In the new town, she became simply the woman who walked her dog every morning along the shore, who waved first to neighbors, who drank tea on her porch at sunset without checking her phone for messages that would never come. Sometimes visitors to the Heritage Park would walk through the restored train car and read the small plaque that mentioned how it had been rediscovered because a woman sought shelter there after being left at the altar, and they would smile at the strange poetry of it without ever knowing the quiet strength it took to sit alone in that metal shell and choose not to feel broken. And Evelyn, miles away by the sea, would feel the same gentle relief she had felt the first night she stayed there, understanding now that being left at the altar had not been the end of her story at all, but the unexpected beginning of a life she hadn't realized she was still brave enough to live.